For President Trump to diminish these victims, it's such a betrayal to victims of sexual abuse. And it's horrific in the sense that the statements he's making about this being a hoax, it just diminishes completely the experiences and the horrors that they suffered. And it's just appalling.
New chapters keep coming in the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Congress has finally acted, seeking the full files from the Department of Justice, as well as depositions from prominent people, including the Clintons. Meanwhile, suspicion hovers over the Trump administration's interactions with Epstein's accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell. There is still no real reason to the question, or no real answer to the question, of why exactly Maxwell was transferred to a cushier prison in Texas right after her interviews with Trump's Deputy Attorney General. That Deputy AG, Todd Blanche, was once Trump's personal lawyer. The politics of the case are causing real trouble for Trump, even with his own base. On Wednesday, J.D. Vance denied reports that a strategy meeting on the issue had been planned at his residence. And Trump, speaking in the Oval Office, once again sought to dismiss the whole scandal as a hoax and as BS. To dig into this, I'm glad to be joined by Barry Levine. Barry is the author of a definitive book on Epstein, The Spider, Inside the Criminal Web of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Barry, thanks for joining us. I want to start with an angle to all of this that I think has got a bit underplayed. We've heard so much recently about the Epstein list or the Epstein files, and those phrases suggest paperwork, which of course there is a lot of, and maybe that would be damning. But in your report, you've pointed out something else, which is that Epstein had secret cameras deployed in basically all his homes, and the government may have that as well. So tell us more about that and the potential significance of it.
Well, thanks for having me on. Listen, the cameras is certainly paramount to, understanding the criminality of Jeffrey Epstein's 2 decades of sex trafficking. What's interesting to me, as I reported in my book, The Spider, is that back in the early 90s, when Jeffrey Epstein was initially based in Palm Beach at his home there in Florida, he actually went to the Palm Beach police and told them that he suspected that some of his employees might have been stealing from him. So he asked the Palm Beach police, could they help him install secret video cameras in his home? And so the irony here is that Jeffrey Epstein initially had the help of local police to put in these secret cameras. Now, nobody was stealing from him. He wanted the cameras in his home so he could record his own sexual activities with these young women and children. But also, it's possible that these cameras may have recorded actions involving some of his wealthy friends and some of his victims. And to me, that is really the most disturbing. Now, we also know that Jeffrey Epstein not only had cameras in Palm Beach, but he had secret cameras at his homes in New York, here in Manhattan, his island, Little St. James in the Virgin Islands, his ranch in New Mexico, the Zorro Ranch, and I believe also his apartment that he had in Paris, France. So this was a man who was extensively taping what was going on in his life and in his crimes over the course of 2 decades. And where are those tapes? As I pointed out in a New York Times opinion piece last week, asking what's in the Epstein files that the government is holding back, let us look at the evidence that shows that there were videotapes. I'm not saying that the public should actually see these very disturbing videos and the still images that Jeffrey Epstein had. But what I'm interested in is the FBI agents. Did they attempt to look at this evidence and attempt to go after any other individuals who were seen on videotape? To me, that's the most interesting thing.
And obviously, Epstein also, because of those cameras, would have enormous capability to have blackmailed or threatened people if other individuals were indeed caught in criminal actions on any of those cameras, right?
Yes, I mean, that's the other side of the equation here, is that Epstein, his whole life, he was a collector of people. He wanted, and he succeeded in the fact that he had friendships with a man who went on to become president twice now, Donald Trump. He had a friendship and relationship with former President Clinton. In fact, that relationship actually took place while Clinton was in office. We know for a fact that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell made more than a dozen visits to the White House and were entertained by Bill and Hillary Clinton. He knew heads of state. He knew the former Israeli prime minister, Ehud Barak. He knew individuals, as have been reported, like Bill Gates. He knew famous scientists. He knew Harvard school executives. He knew governors and other political individuals, people from the celebrity world. Woody Allen was a close friend of his who attended parties at his home. So Jeffrey Epstein collected important people. Now, that's not to say that any of these individuals were involved in any criminality, and none of them have been accused of any wrongdoing. However, there may be other individuals that may not be as famous as the ones I've have mentioned, that also were wealthy people that might have been on the receiving end of some of the victimization involving the young women and children. And that's extremely important to understand. Were there financial individuals that he was blackmailing to get additional funds from? We know of several wealthy billionaires who used Jeffrey Epstein for tax advice, for consultation, for financial services. Some of these men paid handsomely for that. Leon Black here in New York paid more than $160 million to Jeffrey Epstein. And we know that Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon has been going down the financial road. It's not to say that Mr. Black is accused of any type of wrongdoing and has, of course, denied any knowledge of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. But are there secret individuals that we don't know the names of that were being blackmailed by Jeffrey Epstein? That's super important to understand. And I would hope that if the right individuals were able to look en masse at the 300 gigabytes of material, that's hundreds of thousands of pages in the FBI files, that it might take us down the road to some leads in terms of the possible apprehension of some other individuals.
Right. Now, in relation to the element of this that is in the news at the moment, I mentioned the whole Ghislaine Maxwell aspect to this scandal just now. To cut to the chase, Barry, obviously there is a suspicion in some quarters that the Trump administration is seeking some kind of corrupt deal where she would be treated leniently in return for some kind of exculpatory testimony or information about Trump. Is that a reasonable suspicion to have, in your opinion?
Well, listen, Ghislaine Maxwell had relationships, had friendships, not only with Donald Trump back to the earliest days. She got to know Donald Trump in the late 1980s when Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, the press baron from Fleet Street, wanted to make an inroads into America and came to New York. And at one point, Donald Trump was interested in a Trump-branded magazine, and he got to know Ghislaine through her father. So their relationship goes back many decades. Same thing with President Clinton. She was a personal friend of Clinton's. She knows very, very powerful individuals, and I am very concerned as to the dynamic of her and President Trump, in the sense of the fact that we know that Donald Trump, when she was arrested for sex trafficking during his first term in office, never had anything bad to say about her. And it's interesting, does she know any embarrassing secrets about Donald Trump? I'm not necessarily saying there's wrongdoing, but does she know some things that in the light of day today would be uncomfortable if they came out? And as we know about how he treats his friends versus his enemies, she has certainly been in the friends category. And it greatly concerns me as to the leniency that she's presently being shown, because a sexual predator of her nature who has been convicted and sentenced to 20 years behind bars should not be moved to the absolute lowest level of a federal jail facility. That's completely wrong. And I know, having written my book on The Spider and also spending years and years investigating this case, that the victims who are out there have actually been traumatized by the treatment that she's receiving now and the fear that she could eventually be pardoned or having her sentence lessened in some degree by the Justice Department.
Sure.
And
go ahead.
This is something that's just horrible.
Yeah, that's an important point, and I want to return to that before we finish. But just on the issue of what Congress is doing right now, obviously it has made this effort to get the files from the Department of Justice, and there's also this issue of the depositions. Now, I know there's some controversy over the nature of the depositions and whether they're driven in a partisan fashion or not. But what is your level of optimism that we're going to get a greater level of information about all of this?
Well, I don't still understand why, after Donald Trump's administration and Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, had promised complete transparency with the proper redactions of victims and also third parties, why, after what the American public was promised, why those files are not forthcoming. But I am happy at this point, and let's just leave out all the politicizing from both sides of the aisle here. If the lawmakers can push now to get the Justice Department to examine those files, it would be a start. And I would hope that we could get information released that they could begin digging into, and also, in a greater sense, have those files publicly made available, as I said, with the redactions, because we're owed that at this point. The victims are owed that, and certainly the Trump administration's promise to be the most transparent administration, it's important here to finally follow through with that.
Yeah, I think those are all important points. And, frankly, I think a lot of stuff around the whole Epstein matter kind of stinks, and I don't think that is dependent upon having a particular partisan political view or not. I've never been a fan of people being derided as conspiracy theorists over Epstein, because there's so much that seems shady. But I did want to get back to that point you mentioned about the victims, and we did hear the president again yesterday seeming to diminish this, talking about it as a hoax, talking about it in more profane terms than that. And you mentioned the effect on Epstein's victims of minimization, whether it's those kind of comments or the possibility of Ghislaine Maxwell getting some form of clemency. How damaging or hurtful is that minimization process to the victims?
This is bringing up terrible memories of what they endured. We also have to remember, not only does it affect them, it affects their families as they've tried to move on in life from what happened to them in their childhoods that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell ruined, that can never be taken back. 3 of the victims have passed on. Most recently, last April, Virginia Giuffre, who was his most vocal accuser, Jeffrey Epstein's most vocal accuser, took her life in Australia. This is someone who had been tortured her whole life, and still, despite the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell went to jail, Virginia ended up in a terrible state, and we lost her. And previous to that, there were 2 other victims who have passed on from accidental drug overdoses. One of the women, a very brave individual named Carolyn Adriano, actually was one of the 4 who testified against Ghislaine Maxwell at her trial here in New York and helped get her put behind bars. So for President Trump to diminish these victims, it's such a betrayal to victims of sexual abuse. And it's horrific in the sense that the statements he's making about this being a hoax, that these files were written by Clinton or Comey, it just diminishes completely the experiences and the horrors that they suffered. And, it's just appalling in my belief that the president would be saying these things, knowing how traumatized these victims are.
Barry Levine, author of The Spider Inside the Criminal Web of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. I hope we talk again. Thanks for joining the show today.
Thank you so much.